Hello everyone, it's me, Giles with a J, the person who personally narrates this channel. Just remember, that will never change. We're on season 21 and the theme is strange and unusual, so if you have any suggestions that fit that theme, leave them in the comments. Otherwise, if you enjoy the show, slap that subscribe button, uppercut the like button, and turn on notifications. I post new episodes twice a week, a long episode every Monday and a shorter episode every Thursday. Real quick, I want to let you know that I have a bunch of new merch over in my store. I have a shirt that's a play on the receipt you might find after someone bought all their murder supplies from a department store. I also revamped the old "Don't Murder Your Kids" design to look more like the actual "The More You Know" graphic from TV. And I've changed the women's t-shirts to a different brand that's now in stock. I finally found a place that will make doormats that say "Get the fuck out of here." I have two versions, a censored one and an uncensored one. I tried to make them as inexpensive as I could, and those are through a different company than my regular merch, so there's a link to that in the description. I also made a limited edition t-shirt that has the logo on the front and lists all the seasons so far on the back. That shirt will be available for the rest of April, but if you want one for free, the first 10 people to leave a comment on this video with the name of the band I was in that recorded an album when I was 19, I will send you the link to get one of those shirts for free. I only have 10, so be quick. But wait, there's more! I've also made a promo code that will give you 10% off your entire order, besides shipping, at my regular merch store, and that will also be available for the rest of April. At some point during this episode, I will pop up and tell you the promo code, so pay attention. Thanks to all of you who have supported me over the years, and I look forward to continuing to bring you quality content. Now, on to the show. When 82-year-old Irene Silverman vanished from her New York City mansion in 1998, investigators had no idea she was the final piece of a puzzle which had gone unsolved for more than 2 decades. Her disappearance exposed the dark family legacy of 2 monsters who spent years conning and killing their way to the top. This is Monsters. Sandra Louise Singers was born on July 24, 1934 in Oklahoma City. She was the third of 4 children to her parents Mary and Prama. Her father had emigrated to the United States from East India in search of a better life, and while he achieved that dream for a while, it wasn't to last. When Sandra was a toddler, he moved his family from his failing farm in Oklahoma to the promise of prosperity in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, that dream quickly became a nightmare. Prama passed away when Sandra was only 3 years old, leaving her mother to raise the children on her own. With no support and no way to make ends meet, she was forced to beg for food on the streets. When that wasn't enough, she turned to sex work, which spiraled into an alcohol addiction. With no one caring for the children, they turned to petty crime in order to feed themselves. Life was already hard enough, but Sandra also had a mean streak. With no comfort or guidance from her parents, she found cruel ways to entertain herself. Her sister recalled how even when she was a toddler on their farm in Oklahoma, Sandra would use hat pins to torture their goats and dogs. When they moved to LA, Sandra would light matches and hold them under her sister's fingernails. Sandra's vicious streak also extended outside the house. When she was 10 years old, she was caught stealing cheese and turned over to the police. The officer sent to collect her showed pity and decided not to arrest her, instead taking her out for a meal. According to Sandra, however, that apparent act of kindness was designed to groom her. It was 4 months before she told someone what the officer was doing to her. The adults she chose to trust were the owners of a local movie theater where Sandra often begged for food. When she told them about the abuse, they confronted the officer and he left her alone. After that, the couple took Sandra under their wing. They fed and clothed her and offered her money for helping them clean the cinema. A few months later, they enabled her adoption to one of their own family members in Nevada. Mary and Edwin Chambers were a wealthy couple who were unable to have children of their own, but had plenty of love to give. They had already adopted a 6-year-old boy and gladly welcomed Sandra into their home and hearts. So Sandra Singer became Sandra Chambers, and she seemed to thrive with her new family. She did well in school, was on the girls' athletics team, secretary of the Spanish club, co-editor of the school newspaper, and member of the Future Monsters of America. Future Homemakers of America. Beyond her intelligence, Sandra was also a natural beauty. As she grew into her teenage years, her hourglass figure drew the attention of her male classmates, and she was often compared to Elizabeth Taylor. Despite her attractive appearance, Sandra wasn't as confident as she wanted people to believe. Because her father was of Indian descent, her skin was darker than her classmates, and so when she went to school, she would smear pale makeup over her face to cover up her complexion. She also shaved her arms so no one would notice how dark her hair was. But no matter how much Sandra tried to conceal her insecurities, her true nature wasn't as easy to hide. She was known as a confident and outgoing girl with a sharp sense of humor, but she wasn't particularly liked. People either sensed her mean streak or they got caught in the crossfire. Sandra had a way of pitting people against each other to get what she wanted. She would tell one person one thing and then the opposite to someone else, just so she could sit back and watch the fireworks. And then when everything was blowing up, she would put on the sweetest smile for the teachers as if she had no idea what the drama was all about. She was also a bully who seemed to find joy in mocking students for being different, which was exactly the thing she hated about herself. That's usually how it works, though. Sandra's relationships never went beyond surface level, even when it came to her best and only friend, Ruth. Ruth adored Sandra, even though she dictated what Ruth wore, who she could talk to, and how she spent her time. When Sandra got her first boyfriend, Edward Walker, she treated him exactly the same way. By then, Sandra was going by the name Sandy, which she thought made her seem older and more mature. By the time Sandra was in her mid-teens, she had well and truly mastered the arts of lying and manipulation. She saw people as a means to an end, a ticket to whatever next thing she had her eye on. She was a chameleon, able to shift her personality to suit whatever situation best served her interests. That ability to switch between various identities and personalities became Sandra's trademark. After graduating from high school, she moved into a boarding house with Ruth while they worked as secretaries. By then, she had developed a passion for writing short stories and poems. Her vivid imagination enabled her to create entire worlds outside of her own. At night, she would read her latest creation out loud while Ruth dutifully typed out every word. Sandra sent the stories and poems to various magazines and publications, but none of it was ever published. After 6 months, Sandra decided her writing would be taken more seriously if she went to college. So in 1952, she enrolled to study journalism at the University of California in Santa Barbara. When she met her new classmates, she introduced herself as Candy. She thought the name made her sound fun and carefree. At college, Sandra met her next boyfriend and first husband. He fell hard and fast, and after a year of dating, he thought they had a future together. But after one too many incidents of Sandra controlling his every move and manipulating his friends, he decided they couldn't make it work and left California to join the military. He told his friends that she was needy, jealous, and impulsive, but just a few months after their separation, Sandra called him and said she was pregnant. From their one and only intimate experience. He immediately went on leave and returned home to marry her. Sandra Chambers then became Sandra Truman. A few months after their wedding, he was honorably discharged from the military. Right around the same time, he discovered there was no baby and Sandra had never been pregnant. He realized it was yet another one of her manipulations designed to trap him in a marriage neither of them wanted. But even though he knew that, he decided to stay. With his military career over, he began looking for a job that would fulfill his lifelong dream of becoming a high school teacher. The problem he was about to discover was that Sandra was obsessed with money. She constantly belittled him for wanting to be a teacher, and she tried to force him to find a job in sales. When he accepted an offer to teach at the local high school, Sandra called him and said she was leaving. He never heard from her again. Sandra moved back home, right back into the arms of her high school boyfriend, Edward. A few months later they were married, and Sandra Truman became Sandra Walker. Actually, that time she told people her name was Sante, which she thought was a more exotic version of Sandy. Edward worked as a general contractor while Sandra started a business as a professional welcomer. Yes, welcomer. Her company was called Hi, Welcome to California, and its purpose was to, quote, welcome new people, bring in industry, and generally engage in activities to encourage progress, stimulate interest, and foster goodwill for and throughout the state of California. Okay. How she made money is anyone's guess, but whatever she was making, it wasn't enough. Just like she had done with her first husband, she constantly pressured Ed into making more money. He would later say she had an extreme fear of being poor, and she was obsessed with not only having the finest things, but also showing them off. Ed's business was doing okay financially, but they weren't rich. Sandra wanted everyone to think they were, though. One year, she spent $13,000 on gifts for her friends at Christmas. That was the equivalent of Edward's annual salary. The following Christmas, their home partially burned down under suspicious circumstances. Sandra and Ed sued their insurance company over the $10,000 settlement they were offered to repair the damage. 2 months later, Sandra was arrested for stealing a hairdryer from a department store. Ed was shocked by Sandra's actions, mostly because they could easily have afforded to buy it. It happened again with a lipstick and a handbag, followed closely by a string of suspicious fires at several homes Ed was the contractor for. All of the fires resulted in significant insurance claims. Ed didn't know it then, but those incidents were yet another indication that the beautiful and charming girl from Oklahoma was well on her way to becoming a monster. Ed stayed with his wife even when it came out that she had been sleeping with one of his biggest and wealthiest clients, and she had been for 2 years. In 1963, she gave birth to her first child, a son named Kent. Ed believed the child was his, but Sandra would later give varying stories on who the actual father was. Not long after Kent's birth, they moved to Southern California, where Ed re-established his contracting business. But old habits die hard, and in December of 1966, Sandra was arrested 3 times for shoplifting from stores in LA, Norwalk, and Beverly Hills. Except that time, instead of simply walking out of the stores with the items, Sandra had been charging them to other people's accounts using fake IDs. On more than one occasion, she used her young son to help pull off her scams. After all, no one's going to call the cops on a 5-year-old pocketing a watch or slipping a scarf into his mother's bag. After one too many incidents, the clerk got wise to Sandra's scam and she was arrested and charged with shoplifting. She pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor and paid a $200 fine. By that stage, Edward had reached the end of his tether with Sandra's schemes. But before he had a chance to serve divorce papers, she filed her own along with a demand for full custody of their son. That came with a healthy child support payment and alimony. Kent stayed living with his mother until he was 14 years old, during which time she was arrested several more times for petty theft and grand theft. In 1972, Sandra moved with Kent to Palm Springs in search of a new gold mine, and it didn't take long to find it. Almost as soon as she arrived, she caught wind of a wealthy businessman who had moved into town following his divorce. Kenneth Kimes started out as a farmhand but turned his fortunes around after getting into the hotel building business. With a net worth of nearly $20 million, or $150 million today, Sandra saw him as the perfect man to give her access to the unlimited supply of cash she had always dreamed about. It didn't matter that he was 16 years older than her, or that he had kids, or that he wasn't looking for another relationship. All she needed to do was convince him that she was the one he'd been waiting for. To do that, Sandra needed a game plan. She spent weeks tracking Kenneth's every move, hoping to learn exactly what he liked, disliked, and what turned him on. When she found out his favorite color, scent, and beverage, she committed to them completely. Simply being attractive to him wasn't enough. Every other available and not so available woman in Palm Springs were throwing themselves at him already. Sandra needed to be impossible to ignore. When she was certain she had planned everything down to the last detail, she made her move. With confidence, charm, and a perfectly rehearsed introduction, she approached Kenneth and introduced herself as Sante. At first, Kenneth played it cool, but Sandra was a master of her craft. She had gotten his attention by being impossible to ignore. Now she had to make herself impossible to live without. She wove herself tightly into every aspect of Kenneth's life. When he went to a business meeting, she would show up out of nowhere, and when he was dining at an exclusive restaurant, she would book the table right next to him to make it look like they ran into each other serendipitously. Still, it took nearly 2 years for Kenneth to make things official with Sandra. By then, he had spent a considerable amount of money hiring a private investigator to look into every aspect of her background. He knew about her kleptomania, her son, and her 2 ex-husbands. He also knew she didn't have much money, but none of that put him off. She was an expert at stroking his ego, and she made him feel like the powerful and important man that he was, or at least believed himself to be. In time, Sandra was able to convince Kenneth to hire her to do PR for his hotel building firm. With Kenneth's wealth and business connections, she was able to climb the social ladder. She took every opportunity she could to rub shoulders with people who could elevate her status. Sandra made sure they were front and center at high-profile events from California to New York and Washington, D.C., and Kenneth was more than happy to go along with it. He craved prestige just as much as Sandra craved money. Together they played the part of a glamorous, successful couple. Him the hotel tycoon and her the exotic femme fatale. When Sandra managed to get Kenneth named as an honorary commissioner for the celebration of the American Bicentennial, they thought they had a ticket to the global stage. They envisioned joining embassy trips to India and South America to rub shoulders with diplomats, but the invites never arrived. Just like in high school, people were wary of Sandra. Kenneth had made his own way in the world, but she was seen as more of a clinger than someone who truly belonged with high society, no matter how expensive her clothes were. Sandra didn't let that put her off, though. Even when they weren't on the invite list to the elite gatherings they aspired to attend, they simply turned up and walked through the front door. One night, in February of 1974, they talked their way into a reception hosted by then Vice President Gerald Ford. When they were asked to leave, they caught a taxi to a party thrown by the director of the Smithsonian Museum, and when they were asked to leave that, they caught another taxi to a ceremony at the German embassy. When one of the hosts asked them if they were in the right place, they said they had gotten mixed up and managed to get a ride in a diplomatic vehicle across town to an event at the Belgian embassy. When the story of Sandra and Kenneth's escapades hit the news, the FBI launched an investigation into how 2 outsiders had gotten so close to the vice president right under the noses of the Secret Service. The couple were never charged with any crime, but when the storm blew over, it was clear to Kenneth he had truly met his match in Sandra. She brought a fire and unpredictability to his life that he never knew he was missing, and he had begun to crave it. Even when his family warned him that Sandra was a gold digger and she stopped Kenneth's children from his first marriage visiting him, he was unwilling to question her motives. But the relationship with Sandra came at a cost. Over the next few years, she left a trail of civil suits in her wake. There were more suspicious fires, lawsuits over disputed insurance payouts, unpaid invoices to contractors, and several arrests for shoplifting. Sandra loved spending Kenneth's money, and she didn't seem to have a problem with him wasting it on lawyers and court fines to get her out of trouble. In 1975, Sandra gave birth to her second child, a son named Kenneth Jr. 4 years later, she convinced Kenneth Senior to sue his older children, his siblings, and his son-in-law for emotional distress, invasion of privacy, and conspiracy. She had finally and totally broken any bond he had with his family, and now he was all hers. In 1981, they officially got married and Sandra Walker became Sandra Kimes. By then, she had well and truly earned her nickname as the Dragon Lady. For all of the crimes Sandra was so far accused of, there were far worse things going on under her own roof. Controlling her husband and his money simply wasn't enough. She wanted total control over everyone. She recruited young, undocumented immigrants with the promise of free accommodation in exchange for working at one of Kenneth's many homes. When they arrived, she confiscated their passports, threatened to report them to immigration if they disobeyed, and forced them into endless, pointless labor. She made them scrub already spotless floors and forbid them from leaving the house for months at a time. She took their clothes, locked them in cupboards, hit them, withheld food, and burned them with hot irons for any perceived misdeed. She wouldn't let Kenneth Jr. attend school, and instead she brought in private tutors. The way she treated them wasn't much better than the house staff. Some of the women Sandra enslaved were able to escape and went to the police to report the mistreatment, but it took years before the authorities did anything about it. Even when they did, Kenneth stayed by her side. She had complete control over him, his money, and the people in her house. But soon, even that wouldn't be enough. It took until 1985 for Sandra and Kenneth to be arrested for violating federal anti-slavery laws. That time, even their extremely well-paid lawyer couldn't get her off the hook. Sandra denied enslaving the house staff and put on a great show for the jury, but they sided with the prosecution. Sandra was convicted, and despite trying to convince the judge that a round of psychiatric treatment would be enough to teach her a lesson, she was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Kenneth took a plea deal and was released after promising to undergo treatment for alcohol addiction. Sandra only served 5 years of her sentence, and she was released in 1989 as a new woman. Less than a year after her release, Sandra hired Elmer Holmgren to set fire to Kenneth's Hawaiian estate so she could make another fraudulent insurance claim. Fire investigators immediately recognized it was arson, and Elmer was interviewed about his relationship to Sandra. He immediately confessed that she had paid him to set the house on fire. He told the investigators that he had documents to prove his story, but before he could hand them over, his office burned down and everything inside was destroyed. A couple of months after the fire, Elmer told his family that he had been invited on a holiday to Costa Rica with Sandra and Kenneth. He was never seen or heard from again. Meanwhile, Kenneth Jr., or Kenny as he was known, was struggling to adapt to life since his mother returned from prison. During the 5 years she had been away, his life had been relatively normal. There were no screaming matches between his mother and the housekeepers. He was allowed to attend regular school. He made friends, and he wasn't being forced to steal to please Sandra. The time apart had given him a chance to form a very close bond with his father. Unfortunately, when she returned, so did the chaos. Kenneth was 14 years old, which made him old enough to recognize her manipulative nature. The oppressive atmosphere that had once defined their home came flooding back, along with the constant tension. At first, Kenny rebelled and he refused to follow the strict control she tried to impose on his life. He spent more time out with his friends and as little time as possible at home, but Sandra was a master of patience. She knew how to wait and how to wear people down until they bent to her will. All she had to do was get Kenny back on her side, and now that he was almost a man, he would be the perfect accomplice. Kenny had other ideas. He finished high school and enrolled in college, which gave him his first experience living away from home. But old habits die hard, and he constantly got into trouble. There were fights with other students, incidents at campus parties, and bad grades. No matter whose fault any of it was, Sandra was always there to defend him. When the school threatened to kick him out, she hired lawyers to have the ban reversed. When he got into a fender bender with another driver, she had Kenny file a lawsuit claiming permanent and irreversible damage. Kenny was torn between trying to be independent and relying on his mother to get him out of trouble. He was exactly where she wanted him. Then, in 1994, Kenneth died suddenly of an aneurysm. Despite Sandra being his partner for more than 25 years, she never posted a death notice and she didn't hold a funeral for him. It was weeks before she told Kenny about his father's death. She said it was so he could finish his finals without any distractions, but it's more likely that she didn't want anyone to know Kenneth had died because they would come after him for payments of outstanding court orders. When she filed the paperwork for his death, she intentionally provided the wrong social security number and misspelled his parents' names. Most people who knew Kenneth didn't know he had died until many years later. In the meantime, Sandra had a fortune to spend. But the secrecy around Kenneth's death came with an unexpected consequence. Kenny was devastated about his father's passing and that his mother had kept it from him. He refused to go back to college, and instead he moved with a friend to Las Vegas and got a job as a laborer. He kept in touch with Sandra, and he was happy to use his father's homes and money to make his life easier, but he refused to come home. Sandra wasn't going to let him get away so easily. She had worked so hard to mold Kenny into her accomplice, and she wasn't going to let her efforts go to waste. In September of 1996, Sandra suggested that she and Kenny take a trip to one of her favorite places in the Bahamas. They had visited a few months earlier to celebrate Kenny's 21st birthday with a group of his friends, but Sandra wanted some alone time with her son. At least, that's what she told him. What she actually wanted to do was tie up a loose end. And by tie up, I mean eliminate a problem. Saeed Bilal Ahmed was a banking executive and the man in charge of managing Sandra's offshore accounts. He was also an auditor for one of the major banks in the Bahamas, and he had recently stumbled across some discrepancies in the accounts of several of its customers. Although Saeed had known Sandra and Kenneth for more than a decade, there was rarely a reason to meet in person. But one night, Sandra invited him to join her and Kenny for dinner at a popular seafood restaurant. At around 10 p.m., she paid the bill in cash and the trio walked outside. Saeed was never seen again. Not long after his disappearance, the bank he worked for collapsed and customers lost access to millions of dollars in investments. By then, Sandra and Kenny were long gone. In May of 1997, Kenny was arrested for the first time. Sandra was shoplifting lipsticks in her handbag when she was spotted by a police officer. Kenny tried to cover for her by grabbing her bag and making a run for it. When the officer caught up to him, they got into a tug-of-war over the handbag and he lashed out. That landed him in front of a judge charged with 4 felonies, including resisting arrest, strong-arm robbery, battery, aiding an escape, as well as misdemeanor obstruction. As a first-time offender, Kenny pleaded guilty to 1 felony and the misdemeanor, and the other charges were dropped. It was his first run-in with the law, but with a teacher like his mother, it was far from his last. It had taken Sandra 40 years to go from petty crimes to suspicion of murder, but for Kenny, it would only take a fraction of that time. David Kasdan had known Kenneth Kimes for several years when he agreed to let him and Sandra use his name on a deed for one of their homes in Las Vegas. He knew Kenneth was attempting to conceal his assets and protect them from being forfeited in one of Sandra's many outstanding court cases, but he went along with it anyway. What he didn't know was that when Sandra found a target, she never let them out of her sights. After Kenneth's death, Sandra used David's signature on a loan application and used the house as collateral. When David's bank notified him that he owed money on a loan he knew nothing about, he figured there must have been a mistake. Just as he was trying to figure out what had happened, he was contacted by an insurance agent about a suspicious fire at the same property. When Sandra's name was mentioned, he knew he was in trouble. When he called Sandra to confront her about the forgery, she suggested they meet in person. 3 days later, David's body was found in a dumpster in an alley near the Los Angeles International Airport. He had been shot in the neck. Sandra had taken care of another loose end, but this time she had left a paper trail. One of David's friends knew all about the forged loan paperwork from the house in Las Vegas. As soon as he heard about David's murder, he told investigators exactly who they needed to be talking to: Sante Kimes. But by then, Sandra had already moved on to her next scheme. In her mind, she had gotten away with everything so far, except that little 5-year prison stay, and she had no reason to believe getting away with murder would be a problem. The promo code to get 10% off of your regular order besides shipping at my regular merch store is ROCKET, ROCKET. In January of 1998, Sandra visited a car lot Kenneth used to frequent. The owner believed her when she said her husband was traveling overseas and he needed her to order a brand new Lincoln Town Car on his behalf. Sandra asked for the vehicle to be delivered to the Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel at the bottom of Rodeo Drive. The dealership owner sent a friend and his wife to complete the transaction, but when they arrived at the hotel, there was no sign of Sandra. After 2 hours of waiting in the hotel's flashy lobby, she finally appeared with Kenny by her side. She flashed a warm smile and apologized for the delay and offered to treat the couple to dinner to make up for it. She ordered drinks, but the man needed to drive across town that night, so he only had 2. His wife didn't drink, so she stuck with soda, but Sandra kept asking her if she was feeling tipsy yet. When the couple got up to leave, something felt off. The man felt unsteady, and his wife felt strange too. Then Sandra suddenly said she was too intoxicated to read the paperwork and hastily scribbled a name and social security number onto the purchase agreement. She handed over a check for the car and was given the keys to the Lincoln. A few days later, the check bounced and the social security number showed up as someone other than Sandra. Meanwhile, Sandra and Kenny's landlady in Beverly Hills was growing suspicious of her sketchy tenants. They had put big locks on the door, and even though they had paid the first month up front in cash, she had been chasing them for rent ever since. She also noticed that they invited a string of random strangers into their room, which wouldn't have been so weird except they appeared homeless when they arrived and then left the room wearing fancy new clothes. She also thought they seemed a lot closer than a typical mother and son. One day, the landlady decided to take a closer look at some of Kenny and Sandra's belongings, which were stored in the communal garage. Inside, she found pages and pages of notebook paper which had different signatures written out repeatedly as if someone was practicing. She also found papers and a passport belonging to David Kasdan, as well as documents with the name Saeed Ahmed. The landlady wasn't the only one who found Sandra and Kenny strange. More and more people were starting to see through their act, and Sandra's dazzling smile and sweet talk were no longer enough to distract from the growing list of red flags. The unpaid bills, disappearing from their accommodation in the middle of the night without warning, a long list of aliases, mismatched social security numbers and insurance claims on cars, houses, and motorhomes. Not to mention their names turning up in the investigations into the disappearance of Saeed and the murder of David. By early 1998, the pair were wanted for questioning in 3 states and their world was closing in. That said, the only official warrant for their arrest was thanks to the car dealer who was fed up after months of chasing Sandra for payment on the Lincoln Town Car. He filed criminal charges against both her and Kenny on April 9, 1998, and an arrest warrant was issued. That should have been enough to put an end to their deadly run, but before authorities could find them, they had already moved on to the next person on their list. Irene Silverman was an eccentric 82-year-old widow of a millionaire mortgage broker. She lived alone in a 19th-century mansion on East 65th Street in Manhattan, which she had fashionably, if not illegally, converted into 10 short-term rental apartments. The rooms cost $200 per night, and she managed all of the tenancies herself, right from selecting the guests to doing the background checks and collecting payment. She employed 9 house staff to manage the daily cleaning and linen changes for the rooms, as well as a driver to take her wherever she needed to go. Although Irene was well off, her money was tied up in the mansion. She used the rent money to pay her expenses, as well as setting some aside for her ultimate dream of converting her home into a museum to celebrate the art of needlepoint. Irene's mother was the inspiration behind her passion for textiles, with Irene describing her as, quote, "the finest needlewoman in New York." She also had an extensive collection of fabrics and clothing, lovingly curated over the years of international travel as a professional ballerina, which she intended to display in the museum. In 1994, Irene established the Kobe Foundation in honor of her mother, which to this day awards grants to textile and fashion-related projects. Irene was well known in New York society. She loved to entertain in her ground-floor apartment or on the rooftop terrace of the building. Despite her outgoing nature, she hadn't left the house on her own for more than 15 years. After a nasty fall on the street, she made sure she was always accompanied by either a friend or an employee whenever she went out. So when the police received a report that Irene had gone missing from her building, it was immediately concerning. Officers interviewed Irene's staff and tenants of the apartment to see if anyone knew where she might have gone. That's when they discovered someone else was missing too. Irene had recently rented a first-floor apartment to a man named Manny Guerin. His assistant had called Irene to book him a room several weeks earlier. When he showed up to the house, he was wearing a suit and tie with his hair slicked back and driving a new Lincoln Town Car. Manny claimed to be a web page designer, and on paper he seemed like the perfect tenant. Still, something about him made Irene uneasy. She later told a friend that the way his eyes lit up reminded her of someone who had just gotten out of jail. Irene was usually meticulous about running background checks on her tenants, and she never allowed them to move in without verifying their documents, but she was facing a bit of a cash flow problem that month. She was reliant on rental income to cover her expenses, and she had just paid over $34,000 in property taxes and insurance, which left her in need of quick cash. Even though Manny didn't have the right paperwork on him, he did have money. When he pulled out $6,000 to cover the first month's rent, she made him promise that he would drop off the documents in a day or two. He never did. Irene ignored her instincts, and it was a decision she wouldn't live long enough to regret. Manny was a problem from the start. He wasted no time stirring up trouble by telling Irene's employees that she spoke badly about them and encouraging them to quit and come work for him. He kept his head down whenever he passed the security cameras at the front door, and he refused to let the cleaning staff into his apartment. But the strangest part was his behavior when he was inside his room. All day, every day, Manny stood at his front door, watching through the peephole as people came and went. It was obvious to the tenants and the staff what was going on. There was a small space between the floor and the bottom of his door, and his shoes were always visible in the gap. What they didn't realize was that it was Irene he was watching. He tracked her every move and wrote down her exact schedule, who she went out with, and anyone who visited her. Tenants and staff told Irene that Manny made them uncomfortable, and she seemed to be wary of him too. And even though he never handed over his paperwork, she didn't tell him to leave. On Sunday, July 5th, 1998, Irene's hotel was empty. There was just one maid in the building and one tenant, Manny. That morning, Irene's maid brushed her hair and walked her dog before heading down to the basement to get prepared for the week. Around mid-morning, Manny called to say he wanted his room made up. There was no maid service on Sunday, and Manny had refused any cleaning since he had checked in 3 weeks earlier. The maid told Manny he would have to wait until Monday, and he hung up the phone. A few minutes later, he called back and again demanded that his room be cleaned. He also offered an excellent tip. The maid refused again. Then she watched on the security monitor as a person left the building with their back to the camera. There was no one in the building except Manny, the maid, and Irene, so she naturally assumed it was him. A few hours passed and the maid received another call, but that time it was from a woman named Lucy. She told the maid that she had been asked by Irene to pass on some instructions. The woman said the maid needed to take Irene's dog home with her and not speak to any authorities who asked where Irene was. Lucy said Irene wanted some time alone and she would be out of town for a few days. The phone call immediately set off alarm bells, because why wouldn't it? Irene never left the building alone, and she certainly wouldn't have someone else relay instructions about her personal affairs. Something was wrong. The maid rushed upstairs, but there was no sign of Irene in her apartment. She called the building manager, who was equally spooked, and together they notified the police that Irene was missing. As the authorities began their investigation, both the maid and the building manager agreed on one crucial point. The first person the police needed to look at was their strange tenant, Manny. He was nowhere to be found after leaving the building earlier that day. Inside his room, officers found hundreds of sheets of handwritten notes detailing Irene's every move for the past 3 weeks. What immediately stood out, though, was that not every page was the same handwriting. Someone else had been in the room watching with him. Outside, police launched a full-scale search for Irene. They checked hospitals and reached out to her known acquaintances, but no one had seen or heard from her. They were also searching for Manny, but checks on their system told them the name was likely to be fake. By the following night, Irene's disappearance was being talked about across New York. The nightly news broadcast a police press conference asking for tips from the public alongside a photograph of Manny. It was only then that the connection was made. Manny Guerin shared a face with Kenneth Kimes, and Kenneth Kimes was currently locked up in FBI custody at the Federal Plaza in downtown New York, right alongside his mother, Sandra. He was an FBI agent who recognized the face on TV and matched it to the arrests they had made the prior evening, the same day Irene went missing. Kenny and Sandra had been on the FBI's radar since David's body was found in a dumpster in LA, and their names had been linked to a string of crimes across the United States. Agents had tracked the forged loan application to a homeless man who said Sandra and Kenny had set a fire in the Las Vegas property that led to a false insurance claim. Then they spoke to a man who claimed to have sold a gun to Kenny, which was the same caliber as what was used to shoot David. When agents threatened the man with charges for his involvement in the case, he agreed to help them set up a sting to bring Sandra and Kenny to justice. A couple of months later, Sandra called the man to offer him a job managing a 5-story mansion in New York. She told him the building was home to an 82-year-old retired ballerina who danced around in her negligee at 11 p.m. She also asked him for help with a real estate transfer she needed to make. Enough time had passed that the FBI had been able to connect Sandra and Kenny to the warrant for the bounced check at the car dealership. On Sunday, July 5th, the man met the mother-son duo at the New York Hilton Hotel. Agents swept in and arrested Kenny and Sandra without incident. In her handbag was $10,000 in cash as well as pages of documents and passports belonging to Irene Silverman. Even though Kenny and Sandra were wanted for questioning in relation to a murder, a disappearance, and countless other frauds and crimes, the FBI never thought to check if the woman named on the documents was okay. It was only when Irene's face came up on the news report alongside Manny that the agents finally made the connection between the cases. Investigators from New York went to Federal Plaza to speak to Kenny and Sandra. There was no doubt they were involved in Irene's disappearance, but at that point the FBI were unaware of the full extent of the destruction the duo had left in their wake. But they should have known that Sandra and Kenny weren't the giving type. They had spent years stealing, manipulating, and conning their way through life, and that wasn't about to change. When Sandra was confronted with the newspaper photo of Irene, she claimed she had no idea who the woman was. She even accused the officers of fabricating the newspaper just to set her up. Kenny was equally defiant. He told investigators he couldn't reveal Irene's location without his lawyer's approval. Meanwhile, the search for Irene intensified. 50 officers were assigned to the case. They combed through trash bins, garbage dumps, and swamps. Cadaver dogs were also brought in to scour wooded areas of Central Park. Investigators also obtained a warrant to search Sandra and Kenny's Lincoln Town car. Inside were 13 spiral-bound notebooks filled with aliases, detailed notes about David Kasdan and Saeed Bilal Ahmed, and a step-by-step guide outlining how to illegally transfer ownership of Irene's mansion into their own names. It was clear that Sandra and Kenny's latest scheme wasn't just about getting their hands on some fast cash. It was about stealing Irene's home. As per usual, Sandra was the brains behind the scheme. She had learned about Irene's multi-million-dollar mansion after reading a social column in a New York magazine. She made a title search and discovered the property didn't have a mortgage. She wanted to get her hands on the mansion, and she knew the best way to do it was to either assume the identity of its 82-year-old owner or get rid of her altogether. First, she needed an inside man to figure out what made Irene tick. She set Kenny up with a false identity and backstory and spoke to Irene about letting a room to him. Once he had signed the paperwork, they began their surveillance. Kenny would sneak Sandra into the apartment, and together they watched and took detailed notes of Irene's every move. They also installed recording devices on the building's phones to listen in on her private conversations. After Irene's disappearance, previous tenants came forward to say they had found Manny snooping on the higher floors of the building, and an ex-employee admitted showing the tenant through Irene's own apartment in exchange for a few $100s. Sandra also spent her time figuring out how to transfer the building's title over to an offshore corporation she controlled. She kept meticulous notes of every phone call she made, as well as a list of her aliases and who she had used them with. When she was sure of the process, she contacted a real estate lawyer to put her plan into motion. Sandra was at the final stage of being able to transfer ownership of the mansion to herself when she hit a snag. She needed Irene's social security number, but none of their snooping had given them what they needed, so Sandra set up another scam. She posed as a casino employee and called Irene to say she had won an overseas trip. All she needed to do to claim the prize was hand over her social security number, but Irene refused. So Sandra contacted Irene's accountant, claiming to be doing a background check. They also refused to hand the number over. In the end, Kenny and Sandra went for the most basic trick of all. They made a fake social security card for Irene and used her signature for Manny's rental agreement. By July of 1998, Sandra and Kenny had used the fake documents to secure a property tax form, a preliminary residential property transfer, a power of attorney, and a rental agreement. They were well on their way to transferring ownership of the $7 million mansion to their dummy corporation. All they needed was the seal of a notary public to make it official. With a healthy cash bribe, they got the document notarized and waited for the building to be empty so they could take ownership. The 4th of July weekend gave them the perfect opportunity. After Irene disappeared, the FBI combed through Kenny's apartment and uncovered a treasure trove of disturbing items. There were rolls of duct tape, oversized plastic garbage bags big enough to hold a body, a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, ammunition, handcuffs, brass knuckles, a knife, pepper spray, syringes, a receipt for a stun gun, and even a jar of moldy date rape drug. The items painted a clear picture of what had likely happened to Irene. Kenny and Sandra were ready to move the owner out permanently. When the building was empty, they drugged her, restrained her, and murdered her. Then they wrapped her body in plastic bags and stuffed it into the trunk of their car. Although investigators believed Irene was dead before she left the building, the search for her body continued. Walls in her mansion were torn down, construction sites were combed through, and investigators scoured LaGuardia and John F. Kennedy Airport. Even a recycling plant was searched. At that location, they did find a body, but it wasn't Irene's. It belonged to a different murder victim. Sandra and Kenny had been arrested at the Hilton Hotel just after 6 p.m. on Sunday, July 5th. The last call from Kenny's room to demand cleaning was at 2:30 p.m., which meant if they were responsible for Irene's death, they had just 3 hours to murder her and dispose of her body. So state troopers examined every highway within a 3-hour radius of New York City. But despite the exhaustive effort, search teams came up empty. Somehow Kenny and Sandra had done the impossible. To this day, Irene's body has never been found. Kenny and Sandra may not have been willing to talk, but in the end, it was Sandra's own words that led to her undoing. In the notebooks, she had kept records connecting her and Kenny to the disappearance of Saeed, the murder of David, the disappearance of Irene, and countless insurance frauds across at least 3 states. In December of 1998, Sandra and Kenny were indicted on 84 counts of second-degree murder, conspiracy, robbery, attempted robbery, burglary, grand larceny, attempted grand larceny, forgery, eavesdropping, and possession of weapons, stolen property, and forged documents. If convicted on every count, they were facing 131 years in prison. Sandra was 64 years old and Kenny was 23 at the time. They appeared together in court several times. On almost every occasion, they held hands, whispered, and looked into each other's eyes as they attempted to proclaim their innocence. During one of Sandra's court appearances, while she was being sketched, she said, quote, "Please don't make me look like a monster. I'm a mother, not a monster." Even from behind bars, Sandra refused to let anyone else control the narrative about her. She used her time in custody to run a full-scale PR campaign from behind bars. She spent hours on the phone with newspaper reporters repeating the claim that she and Kenny had been framed. She never wavered from her declaration that they were both victims of a corrupt system, but Kenny's lips weren't so tightly sealed. In November of 2000, he agreed to come clean about everything in exchange for prosecutors removing the possibility of the death penalty for him and his mother. He told investigators that Sandra had confessed to killing Elmer Holmgren, the man who burnt down their estate in Hawaii. Kenny also admitted that he and his mother were responsible for Saeed's death in the Bahamas. According to his statement, they had drugged him at dinner, then drowned him in a bathtub before hiring a boat and dumping his body off the coast. No charges were ever filed in the murder, and Sandra claimed Kenny made the stories up purely to avoid the death penalty. But Kenny's statement went on. He confessed that Sandra had ordered him to murder David Kasdan so he couldn't reveal the loan forgery for the property in Las Vegas, and he offered insights into the specifics of Sandra's schemes. All those random strangers were homeless people Sandra had plucked off the street. She would pick them up, offer them food and drink, then dress them in nice clothes and send them off to meet with insurance investigators for one of her various scams. She also collected their documentation, including passports, birth certificates, and social security cards. That gave them a steady supply of aliases she and Kenny could use in other scams. Kenny's confession gave prosecutors enough evidence to secure a conviction against both of them. During their first trial in New York, Sandra and Kenny were found guilty of 117 charges of murder, conspiracy, robbery, illegal weapons possession, forgery, and fraud. During their sentencing hearing, Sandra said she and her son were innocent, and she compared their treatment to the Salem witch trials. In response, the judge called her a sociopath and a degenerate. That's a bit of an understatement. Sandra Kimes was sentenced to 120 years in prison, and Kenneth Kimes received 124 years. During a prison interview with Court TV a few months later, Kenny held a reporter hostage by holding a ballpoint pen to her neck. He demanded that his mother not be extradited to California to face trial for the murder of David Kasdan. The woman was able to break free unharmed, and Sandra was indeed extradited to Los Angeles. In 2001, Sandra and Kenny stood trial for David's murder. To everyone's surprise, Kenny changed his plea to guilty and testified against his mother, but once again it was only in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. During the trial for David's murder, Kenny confessed that they had disposed of Irene's body in a dumpster. Sandra once again made a long statement about being innocent and complained of being mistreated in prison, and once again the judge had to tell her to be quiet. She was found guilty and sentenced to life without parole, but that would only start after she finished her sentence in New York, which was unlikely. Sandra died in prison on May 19, 2014 at the age of 79. Kenny remains incarcerated at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in California. Fortunately for Sandra's first son, he was left in the care of his far more stable father when she married Kenneth Kimes Senior. He grew up and started a family, far removed from the chaos and crime his mother had raised him in. Even from a distance, he understood exactly who she was. He said, quote, "There was absolutely no one who was easier to love than Sante Kimes, and no one was easier to hate. She was a walking contradiction." In news reports, Sandra and Kenny were referred to as grifters, but monsters seems more accurate. Thanks so much for letting me tell you this story. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave a comment. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.